Hello, everyone. I trust that your day and week have gone well. I'm going to begin a 8-week uh, class on the book of Romans. I'll be recording these lectures. I've never done anything quite like this before. I'm sure there will be some bumps and bruises along the way. I hope that you'll bear with me. In the book of Romans, there are 16 chapters. So to cover Romans in 8 class sessions is obviously going to be a challenge. It means that we'll not be able to cover in detail every verse or every couple of verses. But rather, that the task will be to kind of look at Romans um, in larger chunks of material. We'll kind of look at the overall theme or themes that we find in this book. Since we're doing this in 8 weeks, you might say it averages out to 2 chapters a week. It probably will not be quite like that. Today, on our first class meeting, I just want to talk briefly about Romans, the letter, and when it was written and that kind of thing. And then we will get into the first chapter, and I want to devote most of my time on the biblical text with really just 2 verses, because those 2 verses, I believe, and I think most scholars believe, set the table for the rest of the letter. It sets the theme, the controlling idea for the entire book of Romans. Romans is Paul's most well-known letter. It is perhaps the most well-known of all of the writings of the New Testament, with the possible exception of one of the Gospels. It is the longest of Paul's writings, and it's the longest, I think, of any of the letters of the New Testament. It represents sort of the culmination of Paul's thinking. It comes at the end, or near the end, of his active missionary work. Now, as I teach this class, what I'm hoping will happen, and we'll see, is to provide you with some PowerPoint slides to go along with this video lecture that will help reinforce some of the things that I want to say. So from time to time, I'll be saying, look at this slide, and hopefully we'll be able to bring those together and you'll be able to follow along. The first slide that I have on it that you should be looking at is a slide of a map of Palestine that takes us across over into Syria and eastern part of what is now Turkey. I put this slide here because near the top of that slide you will see the city of Tarsus. Tarsus was in the province of Cilicia. It was a large city, one of the largest cities in the Roman Empire. There was a university there, and was a kind of a metropolitan community in which Jews lived and worked, no doubt having their own special quarters, but nevertheless there was more interaction with Gentiles for Jews than would be obviously the case in, let's say, in Judea, in the province of Judea. Paul was born most likely in what we might call a Jewish ghetto in Tarsus. His father, we learn from another text, was a Roman citizen, so he may have been born into some level of affluence, and that would probably give him opportunity to interact not only with other Jews but with Romans. So to some extent, when Paul refers to himself, and as the book of Acts describes him, as one that was called by God to be an apostle to the Gentiles, certainly this is a person who was well suited for that call. A man of two worlds, as one writer described him, who could live in the Jewish world and also could live in the Gentile world. Sometime after his early boyhood years, his parents apparently took him to Jerusalem. Paul says that he grew up in Jerusalem and studied at the feet of Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the leading Pharisaical rabbinical scholar at the time. And the evidence seems to be, even by Paul's own writings, that Gamaliel, to one extent or another, was grooming Paul to take on the place of a Pharisee and a member of the Jewish council, and perhaps maybe even replace him at some point as a leading rabbi. We don't know when Paul was born. Somewhere between 5 and 10 is a good guess. We first are introduced to Paul in Acts chapter 7 at the martyrdom of Stephen the preacher, because we read of him holding the garments of those who stoned Stephen to death, and that he consented or supported this action. That action and other similar types of actions appears to have kind of haunted Paul the rest of his life. Even though he accepted and believed that he had been forgiven by God, yet he still, I think, felt the sting of his sins, because he would refer to himself as the chief of sinners, and someone who, because he had experienced God's grace, worked harder than all the rest, and it's only by grace that he is what he is. So, after that death, a major persecution broke out, according to Acts, and Paul takes on a leading role in this persecution, receives letters from the high priest that gives him permission to travel to Damascus, which was several hundred miles away, to bring back refugee Jewish believers in Jesus, and arrest them and imprison them. In other of Paul's writings, he indicates that not only did he arrest some, but seemed to have been responsible for the death of more than one Christian. But on the way to Damascus, he met the risen Christ, and that changed his life. His conversion, if one were to date that, has been estimated between 34 to 35 AD. One of the reasons for that date is based on some early Christian tradition that says that the resurrection appearances of Jesus, this was a belief in the early church, the resurrection of Jesus, the appearances of the resurrection of Jesus, where he would appear to the apostles and to other people, took place over a period of about a year and a half. So depending on how you date the death and resurrection of Jesus and the day of Pentecost, and how long, what is the time span between the day of Pentecost and the road to Damascus experience for Saul, it may be that something like 34 to 35 AD is at least a plausible theory. He would be baptized by the preacher Ananias. He would spend some time in Damascus, but then would leave, escape from Damascus, and go to Arabia, where he would stay for a period of time. We're not sure exactly what he did there, if he preached there or if he spent time sort of being tutored by God there. We're not sure. And then apparently returned to Damascus, according to Galatians, spent some time there. But um, he ends up going to Jerusalem, where he's introduced to the early church for the first time as a former persecutor and now a Christian. But things get so rough for Paul because some of the oppositional forces in Jerusalem, learning of his presence, consider Paul to be a traitor, and so some of them are out to kill Paul. So Paul flees to Cilicia, his home province, most likely to his hometown of Tarsus, where he stayed for many years. Some say perhaps as long as 14, according to the book of Galatians. Then after that period of time, Barnabas got him and brought him to the Antioch of Syria, where he would join Barnabas in a ministry in Antioch, which was described in Acts as a church in which there are both Jew and Gentile believers in Jesus, and one might call it the first integrated church. That may be a little overstating it, but we do see that. And in fact, in Galatians, Paul talks about Peter at one point kind of backing away from his fellowship with the Gentile believers because of what he perceived would be the offense taken by some more conservative believers, Jewish believers coming in from Jerusalem. And Paul takes him to task for that. That suggests that there were both Jewish and Gentile Christians that were interacting with each other in the city of Antioch, which was a very metropolitan city where Jews and Gentiles in general interacted with one another. A famine broke out. They went down, Paul and Barnabas, with contributions from the Antioch church presented to the elders there. And then sometime they return, and this coincides with the death of Herod Agrippa. He receives a call, he and Barnabas together receive a call to go into mission work. And Acts tells us that Paul engages in 3 missionary journeys. I supply some maps that outlines or traces each one of those journeys. Now, the missionary journeys of Paul on the slide indicate that took place over a period of about 13 years, from about year 47 to about 58. And you notice in the first slide, the journeys of Paul, basically they leave Antioch, they go to Cyprus, and then they go up to central Turkey or Asia, and then kind of go east, and then return and come back. Some of those places, the population was exclusively non-Jewish, and this was groundbreaking, and it was also controversial, and it led to the conference in Jerusalem, where people had to now struggle with, okay, what do we feel? What's our opinion about Jews and Gentile Christians fellowshipping with one another? And are we going to expect more of Gentile believers than simply their belief in Jesus? Should they not take on the Mosaic law? So you have that going on. Following the resolution of that conference, Paul goes on his second journey without Barnabas. This journey, according as the map would indicate, takes them all the way to the western side of the Aegean Sea, across from Asia or Turkey to Macedonia, to cities like Philippi, Thessalonica, and then southward towards to Athens and to Corinth, and then to Athens, and then following his time in it's Athens, Corinth, and then after his time in Corinth, which lasted for about a year and a half, he begins his journey back. And then shortly after his return from his second journey, he engages on his third journey with Timothy and Silas and others. And this journey, which basically follows the same route, if you look at the map, you can see this same route as the second journey, except they don't go across the sea right away. They end up in Ephesus, where Paul says later on that he stayed in Ephesus for 3 years. And then after that 3-year period, riot breaks out, opposition increases, and he leaves there, and he crosses over to Macedonia and down to Corinth, where he states in Acts chapter 20 that he stayed in Corinth for some 3 months. And that would be the end of the third journey. And then he would begin making a long trip back to Jerusalem, which would be his last trip returning from a missionary journey, carrying offerings from brethren all over the place to supplement the lack of money and goods that the poor believers in Judea were facing because of the ongoing problem of the famine. Okay, and then following the missionary, after he got to Jerusalem, then he would be arrested, and he would spend time in prison for maybe 4 or 5 years. Some time in Jerusalem, a couple of years in Caesarea, which was the capital of the Palestine area. And then after appealing to Caesar, he sails across the Mediterranean with a little hiccup in Malta, or after the shipwreck, and then on to Rome, where he would spend at least 2 years of imprisonment there. Now, what happened to Paul after those 2 years is a matter of debate. But what some people think he was released, some people think he died. My point for us in this study is that the outline of Paul's life, I think, for our purposes, we have his early years, from birth, childhood, young manhood to his conversion, his early years of ministry, his missionary years, his imprisonment years, and then the aftermath, whatever that might be. And that fits into how we understand Paul's writings and where they fit into his life. A large chunk of his writings took place while engaged in missionary journeys. During his first missionary journey, or just before, some scholars believe he wrote Galatians. And then during his second journey, most scholars believe he wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And then during the third journey, most scholars, virtually universally, agree that he wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans. Other scholars believe instead of the first journey, Galatians may have been written during the third journey. That's irrelevant for our purposes. For our purposes, what we need to note is that Paul wrote Romans during his third missionary journey. Now, we can kind of be a little more specific about that by noting a few things. In Acts 18, verse 23, Paul begins his third missionary journey, and that will take him to Ephesus, where he will spend some 3 years. And then eventually he would leave there. But because of things, and we don't have time to get into all the text in this study, it appears that he wrote 1 Corinthians during that 3-year period. And then at some point he leaves Ephesus after the 3-year period, crosses over to Macedonia, and while in Macedonia, perhaps Philippi, he writes 2 Corinthians. And then continues to travel southward towards Greece, Athens, and then Corinth, and stays there according to Acts 20 verse 3, he stayed there for 3 months. And it is believed that he wrote Romans during that period of time. So, sum it all up. Paul wrote Romans during his third missionary journey while he was in Corinth. The date for that would be around 58 or so. And I could go into more detail as to how we arrive at the date of 58. Why Paul wrote this has been a subject of debate, and I'm going to kind of table a discussion on that at this point. I'll just say this much. I believe it is a mistake to simply read Romans as a textbook on Christian doctrine. It's easy to kind of look at Romans that way. Certainly, there is considerable teaching on Christian doctrine, particularly on the gospel. But there are indications throughout this letter that Paul is concerned about more than simply doctrine. He seems to be concerned about the church, and particularly the local church, perhaps even the church in Rome. I'm not yet sure I know if I believe that he was concerned about what was going on in Rome, particularly. He may have been. But I think he is concerned about some practical, relational, maybe moral challenges that churches were facing at that time. And some of these are the kinds of challenges that even we face today. So, I hopefully will be able to address this a little more clearly when we come near to the end of the study. Now, let's get into the text itself. The first 7 verses of chapter 1 is the introduction. And then verses 8 through 15 is the expression of greetings and thanksgivings. This is a typical way how an ancient letter would read. You introduce yourself, you introduce who you're writing to, you might say a few words of commendation or greeting, and then you go to a little more extensive kind of greeting, maybe a prayer, maybe a wish, and then you launch into the reason why you wrote it, what are the main concerns that you have. Okay, so for the first part, Paul says, Paul is servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, the gospels concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness in resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for the sake of his name, including yourselves who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. To all God's beloved in Rome, who are called to be saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. A few specific things to note. First of all, Paul identifies himself as a servant of Christ, or maybe more literally, a slave of Christ. He saw himself as under the complete authority of Jesus. He is not directing his ways. Christ is directing his way. Christ is his master. And there's no other master one could possibly want to serve than the master, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah. Secondly, he calls himself an apostle set apart for the gospel of Christ. The word for apostle, actually there is a verb form of this as well, which means to send. An apostle is one who has been sent. sent by somebody else, usually an authority figure, on a mission. He has been commissioned by an authority figure and sent to fulfill a particular job. He represents the one who sent him with some kind of a message. We might refer to this person today as an ambassador or an envoy. And when he speaks not of his own, but he speaks whatever the master told him to say. That's what an apostle is supposed to do. And he said he was set apart for the gospel. And that word set apart appears in more than one place in Paul's writings. And obviously there is a sense of calling. But in Galatians he says he was set apart before he was born by God. So this idea of being set apart suggests something like God had it planned for Paul to serve in this capacity all along. And his calling that God had set him apart was to be God's messenger to the Gentiles. And he talks about that to the Gentiles. Now, what is it that he's to do? He is to proclaim the gospel, which is concerning Jesus, and then he describes Jesus as his son, and then he says, one who descended from David according to the flesh, and was shown to be the Son of God with power by virtue of the resurrection. And what Paul is doing there is that he's describing Jesus in terms of his two natures. There is the human side of Jesus. He is descended from David, which is also the royal side. But there is the divine side of Jesus. He is not made the Son of God. He is shown to be and declared to be the Son of God with power. One writer said that during his earthly ministry, Jesus was the Son of God in weakness, in human weakness. He was mortal. He could suffer pain and sickness and hunger and tiredness and ultimately death. At the resurrection, he is now seen to be the Son of God in power. Power over sin, power over death. Truly the Son of God. And so, that's what the message is about. It's about Jesus. The Jesus who is the Messiah, Son of David. The Jesus who is the Son of God in power because he has been raised from the dead. And Paul's mission is to preach this message to bring about faith and obedience among the Gentiles. The second part, the greetings and expression of thanksgiving in verses 8 to 15, Paul acknowledges his thanksgiving for this community's existence, their character, their faith, and wishes to be able to see them. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed through all the world. For God, whom I serve with my spirit by announcing the gospel of his Son, is my witness that without ceasing I remember you always in my prayers, asking that by God's will I may someday or somehow at last succeed in coming to you. For I am longing to see you, so that I may share with you some spiritual gift to strengthen you, or rather, so that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that I have often intended to come to you, and thus far have been prevented in order that I may reap some harvest among you, as I have among the rest of the Gentiles. I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. Hence my eagerness to proclaim the gospel to you who are in Rome. Apologize, having a little trouble seeing the print. So, he acknowledges and is grateful for this community of faith, their presence, their faith. He prays for them continually. He wants to be with them. He desires to come, and he's been wanting to come for some time, but he's been prevented for some reason. And one of the reasons why he wants to come is to impart what he calls some spiritual gift. We don't know what that gift was. The word for spiritual gift, notice in the handout, the Greek word there is charisma. We might pronounce it charisma. It literally means something related to grace, a grace thing, a grace gift, or something like that. It is often translated in other places in the New Testament, particularly the writings of Paul, as spiritual gift. 1 Corinthians 12, it talks about tongues and prophecies and healings and so forth, uses this word to describe those kinds of spiritual gifts. So some have wondered if Paul desires to go to them and to lay his hands on the people there that they might receive some supernatural charismatic gift. But he says that we might be mutually encouraged by one another, by their faith. So maybe the gift isn't the gift of healing or tongues or prophecy. Maybe it's the gift of encouragement. In Romans 12, encouragement is going to be one of the gifts that some people receive, and that to one degree or another, all of us can be encouragers to others. And when he talks about his desire to come to them that's been prevented, he says that one of the results of that has been that he has reaped a harvest and of souls, particularly among the Gentiles, and that he is a debtor. That means he's the sense of obligation to preach the Gospels to everyone, no matter whatever their station in life. The barbarians, the uncouth, the uneducated, the wise, the foolish, those that are cultured, those that are not, with the gospel. That seems to be his primary goal. And that segues into what this letter is about. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith and for faith, as it is written, the just, or the one who is righteous, will live by faith. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God to save everyone who has faith. It's to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. The gospel reveals the righteousness of God. It is a righteousness by faith and for faith. And it reflects that the righteous will live by faith. What do each one of these expressions or phrases mean? First of all, I am not ashamed of the gospel. The gospel is the theme of this letter, by the way. And to say I am not ashamed is a kind of an understated way to say that I'm proud of the gospel. But maybe he states it this way because there are people that he's encountered, Christian people perhaps, who have been ashamed of the gospel. Well, what would they be ashamed about? Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, Paul says, for the word or the message concerning the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. So perhaps there was this opinion among some Christians that, and this would apparently have been more among the Greeks and the Romans, that the preaching of the gospel was not a popular message in the unbelieving world. For Greeks, the idea of a crucified Messiah would be silly and stupid and offensive, because a successful man that you would honor and respect as a man of power and aggression and victory, not one who willingly submits his life and sacrifices his life like that. For Jews, it would be difficult to accept this because they understand the cross as a sign of divine curse. And the Messiah, the deliverer, the anointed one, will come not to be cursed and to be defeated, but to destroy the enemy. That was their point of view. So in reality, both sides, there would be people who would have a problem with this. But Paul is not embarrassed. For Paul, this message about the cross is, in fact, a source of power. He calls it the power of God to save everyone who has faith. Now, the word for power here means something like the power to be transformed. So it's not a word, it comes from, our word dynamite comes from the Greek word here, but it is a word that's in Paul's writings. It's often associated with the gospel. And the point here is the salvation is not found, it's not rooted in human goodness. One cannot be saved on the basis of human works. The ability to do enough good things that God will reward that person with righteousness or with salvation. Rather, humans can find salvation or receive salvation not by good works, but by faith, by trusting in God, who is the Savior and made salvation possible through Jesus Christ. So this gospel message is a message about transforming power. It is a transformative event. God sent Jesus to the world, who came and died on a cross and then defeated sin and death, so that the defeat or victory over sin and death can be true for each of us. So that's why it's the power of God. He says it was to the Jew first and to the Greek. Now, that is the way Paul did his mission work. When you read in the book of Acts, he would go to the synagogue. And then if they rejected him, then he would reach out to the Gentile. And of course, God first engaged in covenant relations with Israel, and then later the Gentiles would be added. And so perhaps that's why Paul says this. Later on, Paul's going to describe something about how God's going to kind of make all this come together, that Israel hears the message, Israel rejects the message, the Gentiles hear the message, the Gentiles accept the message, Israel, in reaction to the Gentiles accepting the message, reconsider and accept the message. Something like that. We'll get into that when we get to chapter 11. But his main point is, whatever the process is, and whether you're first or second, the gospel is for everyone. And what the gospel does is the gospel reveals the righteousness of God. Now, what does it mean to talk about the righteousness of God? This is a very common word in the New Testament. It appears some 33 times in Romans, and 8 times, 30, righteousness appears like 33 times in Romans, and 8 times righteousness of God, that expression appears. There seems to be 3 possible interpretations of this expression. It could mean God's righteous attributes or character, that God is a righteous, loving, fair, just God. Or number 2, it could refer to God's righteous will and standard. So when Christ came and died on the cross, so there's this exchange of the old law with the new law, the law of Moses for the law of Christ. Maybe something like that. Or God's righteousness may not be so much about attributes, as though that's some kind of an abstract idea, or simply laws, but about how God works. That it's about God's righteous activity. And this seems to be a way that's more consistent with how the Old Testament talks about God and even people. In other words, you don't talk about somebody in the abstract. If a person's good, or if a person's loving, or if a person's unjust, they are so because they have acted a certain way. So God is Redeemer because he delivered Israel out of Egyptian bondage. He is just because he gave a law that is just. He is loving because he's acted lovingly. And the New Testament picks up on that by saying God is love, and he's shown it by the gift of his Son. So it would be a way of saying the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. In it, we see how God rights wrong. And we see how God makes human beings right with him. And we see how God can be both merciful and show mercy, and without giving up or betraying his sense of justice. So, the gospel reveals this. It isn't like the gospel revealed it in the past. Every time the gospel is preached, it reveals this. And it tells how human beings are being made right with God. And it's from faith to faith. That the gospel is preached, somebody receives it by faith, shares it with somebody else, they receive it by faith, from faith to faith. That's one way how you can interpret that. Another one might be that the gospel is about the faith of somebody, of Jesus, or the faithfulness of Jesus, meaning the gospel is about Jesus who faithfully carried out God's plan of salvation for the world by coming to earth and submitting to a horrible death, being buried and raised to new life. That it may be about that. So, whichever way it is, the point is, the gospel is about faith from beginning to end. It is never about human works. And then he ends this section by saying, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. This comes from Habakkuk 2:4. It's found here and in Galatians 3:11, and also in Hebrews 10:38. Martin Luther translated this as, he who through faith is righteous shall live. So the point is, we find life when we receive righteousness as a result of our faith. That's kind of what Luther was trying to say. Most interpreters agree that this means that faith in God is what guides and shapes one to become right with God. So it's not good people live by faith, but that people through faith can be regarded by God as righteous and can find life in that. And so that's the theme of Romans. Next week, we'll look at how he begins to develop that theme. And he'll talk about how all of us have fallen so far short of God's righteousness and glory. And we'll see you next week.